The void around Valdris 7 burned with the light of dying ships and the flash of energy weapons that had been firing for 3 months. Without stop, War Marshal Subin watched from the bridge of her flagship as another Vorth cruiser exploded in a ball of green fire, and she felt nothing anymore because this was the 100th ship she had seen die today, and the 1,000th this week, and still the insect creatures kept coming with their chittering voices and their hive-mind coordination that made them fight like parts of one giant machine. The Krex Empire had called their fleet invincible when it left the homeworld 6 months ago with 500 ships and 50,000 of the finest scaled warriors in the galaxy. But now, Subin counted less than 200 vessels still capable of fighting, and the Vorth Collective seemed to have an endless supply of reinforcements pouring through the hyperspace gates they had built around this worthless rock of a planet. Subin had reptilian, features like all her kind with green-gold scales that caught the light from the tactical displays, and yellow eyes that could see across vast distances. But right now she could only see death and destruction spreading through space like a virus that consumed everything it touched. On the other side of the battlefield prime mind, Jamin coordinated the Vorth assault through the neural network that connected every insect soldier to his consciousness, and he felt their deaths like pinpricks against his mind as Krex plasma cannons tore through chitin armor and vaporized his children by the hundreds. The Vorth had evolved from hive insects on a world where cooperation meant survival and individual thought meant death. So when they reached the stars, they brought their unity with them and turned it into a weapon that could overwhelm any enemy through pure numbers and perfect coordination. But even the hive mind had limits, and Jamin could feel those limits approaching like a wall of exhaustion that threatened to crush his sanity. Both sides had been fighting over Valdris 7 because deep scans showed rare minerals in the planetary core that could power hyperspace engines for 1,000 years, but now the mining stations were smoking ruins and the orbital platforms were debris fields, and neither side had the strength left to claim the prize they had killed so many to win. The latest engagement had been particularly brutal, with Krex dreadnoughts ramming Vorth bioships in suicidal attacks that left both vessels as expanding clouds of superheated plasma, while fighters swarmed through the wreckage like metal insects feeding on the corpse of a giant beast. Subin was preparing to order another attack when her communications officer Haye Jin suddenly straightened at her console with her scaled fingers dancing across holographic controls as she tried to make sense of readings that should not exist. The young Krex had joined the fleet fresh from the academy with dreams of glory and conquest, but 3 months of continuous warfare had taught her that space combat was mostly waiting, punctuated by moments of pure terror when death came screaming out of the dark at relativistic speeds. Haye Jin had been monitoring enemy communications when her sensors detected something impossible moving through the battlefield with calm precision while ships died around it like moths in a flame, and she checked her readings 3 times before she believed what she was seeing on the other side of the battle. Daewon felt the disturbance through his connection to the HiveMind network, like a whisper in a language he did not understand, and he focused his consciousness through the sensor arrays of a dozen scout ships to confirm what his instincts were telling him. The Vorth tactical coordinator had been bred for war planning with enhanced cognitive abilities that let him process battlefield data faster than any organic mind should be able to, but what he was seeing now made no sense according to any tactical doctrine he had ever studied. Both fleets detected the anomaly at the same moment, and weapons fire began to slack off as commanders tried to understand what they were looking at and whether it represented a new threat or just another piece of debris in a graveyard that already contained the remains of 1,000 ships. The object was small compared to the massive warships that dominated the battlefield, but it moved with purpose through the chaos while broadcasting a signal on standard frequencies that made every captain and commander pause in confusion. Subin listened to the transmission with growing disbelief because the voice was calm and unhurried, as if its owner was discussing the weather instead of drifting through a battle zone where a single stray shot could vaporize any unshielded vessel in seconds. The signal identified itself as coming from a survey ship of something called the Terran Survey Corps, and the speaker claimed to be Commander Teho requesting safe passage because his vessel was disabled and he was unarmed and posed no threat to either fleet. Jamin felt confusion ripple through the hive mind as his children tried to process this new information and fit it into categories they understood. But humans were not in their databases, and the ship design was unlike anything in their records. The vessel itself was unremarkable at first glance, with smooth hull plating and no obvious weapons, but something about its movement patterns suggested technologies that neither the Krex nor the Vorth had seen before, because it glided through gravitational fields with an ease that implied very advanced propulsion systems. Tae-ho continued broadcasting his message with patient repetition while both fleets tried to decide what to do about this unexpected development. And gradually the weapons fire stopped completely as thousands of warriors focused their attention on a single small ship that should have been insignificant. Subin found herself staring at the tactical display, where the human vessel appeared as a blue dot, moving steadily through the red and green markers that represented her own forces and the enemy fleet. And she realized that, for the first time in months, the battlefield had gone completely silent. The Krex War Marshal had fought in dozens of campaigns across the galaxy, and she had seen every kind of enemy the universe could produce, from energy beings that lived in stellar coronas to mechanical intelligences that converted entire worlds into computation matrices, but she had never encountered anything like this. Commander Tae-ho spoke with an accent that suggested his species had evolved vocal cords different from both Krex and Vorth. But his words were clear and his meaning was unmistakable, even though he was calmly requesting safe passage through what was arguably the most dangerous region of space in the local galactic arm. Daewon tried to analyze the human ship through the collective consciousness of his warriors, but their reports only deepened the mystery, because the vessel appeared to be exactly what its occupant claimed it was, and yet something about the whole situation felt wrong in ways he could not articulate. The Vorth had conquered a dozen star systems through their ability to think as one mind and overwhelm enemies with perfect coordination. But unity also made them vulnerable to things they could not understand, because when one mind was confused, the confusion spread through the entire network like a virus. Haye Jin monitored the human transmission and noticed details that her commanders might miss, because young officers often saw things that experienced taught veterans to ignore, and what she saw was that Commander Tae-ho spoke like someone who was not afraid, even though he was surrounded by enough firepower to sterilize a continent. The communications officer had studied xenobiology as part of her training, and she knew that most species showed stress through changes in vocal patterns when they faced danger, but the human voice remained steady and calm, as if its owner genuinely believed he was safe, despite being caught between two fleets that had been trying to exterminate each other for months. Both Subin and Jae-min found themselves facing a decision they had never expected to make, because their war had become so total and consuming that the idea of anything existing outside it seemed impossible. And yet here was clear evidence that the galaxy contained other powers that neither side had accounted for. The silence stretched across the battlefield as thousands of warriors waited for orders while their commanders tried to process the implications of first contact with a species that appeared to treat their epic struggle as a minor inconvenience to be politely navigated around. Tae-ho continued his patient broadcast while his ship moved through the debris field with mechanical precision, and both fleets began to realize that they were no longer the only players in this game. War Marshal Subin made the decision that would change everything when she ordered her fleet to establish a temporary ceasefire with the Vorth Collective, so both sides could deal with the human situation without having to worry about getting shot in the back. The order felt strange on her tongue, because Krex warriors had been bred for conquest, and the idea of working with their enemies went against every instinct she possessed. But something about Commander Tae-ho made her scales itch with unease, and she wanted answers before the shooting started again. Prime Mind Jaemin agreed to the ceasefire through encrypted channels because his tactical analysis suggested that this unknown factor could change the entire balance of the war, and the hive mind needed time to process new information before deciding how to respond to threats they did not understand. The human ship responded to their joint communication with calm acknowledgement, and Tae-ho agreed to come aboard the Krex flagship for what Subin carefully called a discussion rather than an interrogation, because she was not entirely sure which one it would turn out to be. Commander Tae-ho arrived in a small shuttle that moved with the same unsettling precision. as his main vessel, and when the docking bay doors opened, he stepped out wearing a simple gray uniform that looked like it had been designed by someone who cared more about function than intimidation. Subin got her first look at a human and found herself studying a biped with pale skin and dark hair, who stood roughly the same height as a Krex warrior, but with a much lighter build that suggested his species had evolved in a lower gravity environment than most spacefaring races Taeho showed. No signs of stress or fear, as armed Krex soldiers escorted him through corridors lined with weapons displays and battle trophies that were meant to intimidate visitors and remind them of the Empire's military might. The human carried himself with quiet confidence, as if he had done this before many times, and when Subin met him in her command center, she noticed that his eyes moved constantly, taking in details about ship design and crew disposition with the trained observation skills of a professional intelligence officer. Subin had prepared for this meeting by reviewing everything her databases contained about first contact protocols, but those files assumed she would be dealing with primitive species that had just discovered spaceflight. Rather than someone who seemed completely comfortable aboard an alien warship, Taeho declined the offer of refreshments with polite thanks and settled into the chair they provided without any apparent concern about being surrounded by soldiers who could kill him in seconds if their commander gave the word. The war marshal began with standard questions about his species and their territorial claims, but Taeho answered with information that raised more questions than it settled, because he spoke about human space as if it was vast and well-established, rather than the single ship she had expected. When Subin asked about his mission in this sector, Taeho explained that the Terran Survey Corps had been observing the conflict between the Krex Empire and Vorth Collective for several weeks as part of their standard intelligence-gathering operations in regions where human expansion might eventually extend. The casual way he mentioned surveillance made Subin's scales prickle with anger, because the idea that some unknown species had been watching their most important military operation like it was entertainment struck at the heart of Krex. Pride Taeho seemed to understand her reaction, and he offered to share some of his observations as a gesture of goodwill, which turned out to be a mistake from Subin's perspective, because what he told her next shattered her confidence in ways she had not thought possible. The human commander produced a small device that projected holographic displays showing detailed analysis of both fleets, including ship classifications, tactical formations, and supply line vulnerabilities that should have been impossible for an outside observer to gather. Subin watched in growing horror as Taeho pointed out weaknesses in her defensive positions that her own tactical staff had missed, and explained how the Vorth could exploit those gaps if they adjusted their attack patterns in ways that seemed obvious once he pointed them out. Even worse was his analysis of the strategic situation, which he described as essentially pointless, because both sides were fighting for resources they could not hold even if they won, and the real winners would be whoever moved in to claim the wreckage. After the two empires finished destroying each other, Taeho spoke about military tactics with the casual expertise of someone who had studied warfare across multiple species, and when Subin asked how a survey mission could gather such detailed intelligence, he smiled in a way that made her realize she was not dealing with a simple explorer. The human explained that his ship had been monitoring communications, analyzing movement patterns, and conducting passive scans that mapped everything, from reactor outputs to crew rotation schedules, while both fleets focused their attention on trying to kill each other. Subin felt cold fear creep through her bloodstream as she realized that if humans could gather this much information from a single small vessel, then their intelligence capabilities were far beyond anything the Krex Empire had ever encountered. Meanwhile, aboard his own flagship, Prime Mind Jaemin was conducting his own analysis through the Hive Mind network and reaching conclusions that disturbed him even more than Subin's discoveries, because Vorth group consciousness gave him perspectives that individual minds could not achieve. The collective had been observing human behavior patterns through thousands of eyes, and the data suggested that Taeho was not just confident, but genuinely unconcerned about his safety, which implied either insanity or knowledge of protection that neither alien fleet could see. Jaemin ordered his scouts to conduct deeper scans of the human survey ship, and the results made him wish he had not asked, because the vessel's energy signatures indicated technology that was at least a generation ahead of anything in Vorth databases. The ship appeared to be running on standby power, but even its inactive systems showed efficiency ratings that suggested humans had solved engineering problems that still challenged the greatest minds in the collective. When Jaemin shared his concerns with the tactical subminds that coordinated fleet movements, the response was immediate alarm because if humans could build ships this advanced, then their military vessels would be proportionally more dangerous. Back in the Krex command center, Tai Ho was answering questions about human space, with casual references to multiple fleet deployments and ongoing survey operations that painted a picture of a species that was actively expanding across the galaxy. Subin tried to get specific information about human military strength, but Tai Ho deflected those questions with diplomatic skill while mentioning details that suggested humans had been watching other species for much longer than anyone had realized. The human commander talked about comparative studies of military doctrines across dozens of different species, and when Subin asked how many others he had observed, Tai Ho paused as if considering whether that information was classified. His eventual answer that humans had been studying galactic military development for several decades made Subin realize that while the Krex Empire and Vorth Collective had been focused on each other, there had been another player moving quietly through the background, gathering intelligence and making preparations. Tai Ho mentioned other human survey teams operating in different sectors with the casual tone of someone discussing routine assignments, and Subin began to understand that what she was seeing represented just one small part of a much larger operation. The human seemed genuinely puzzled by the intensity of the Krex-Vorth conflict, and when he asked why two advanced species would waste so many resources fighting over a single planet, Subin found herself struggling to explain strategic concepts that had seemed obvious before this conversation. Tai Ho listened to her explanation with polite attention, but his questions revealed assumptions about galactic politics and resource management that suggested humans thought about warfare on scales that neither the Krex nor Vorth had considered. When Subin asked about human territorial boundaries, Tai Ho gave coordinates that encompassed regions both empires had considered unexplored space, and his casual mention of established colonies and shipping routes made it clear that humans had been active in those areas for years. The War Marshal realized that her intelligence services had failed completely because they had been so focused on immediate threats that they had missed the emergence of what might be the most significant new power in the galaxy. Tai Ho concluded the meeting by requesting permission to return to his ship so he could file his report with his superiors, and when Subin asked what that report would contain, he smiled. Again, with the same unsettling confidence that had marked their entire conversation. The human commander thanked her for her hospitality and mentioned that his observations of Krex military protocols had been very educational before walking out of the command center with the same calm composure he had shown throughout their discussion. Subin watched him go and realized that she had learned far more about human capabilities than Tai Ho had revealed about his own mission, and the implications of that imbalance would keep her awake for many nights to come. Commander Tai Ho returned to his survey ship with what appeared to be routine medical supplies and a request to examine wounded personnel from both fleets, which he presented as a humanitarian gesture that would demonstrate human goodwill toward all sentient species. Subin hesitated before granting permission because allowing an unknown alien aboard her medical facilities violated every security protocol in the Krex military handbook, but something about refusing aid to her wounded warriors felt wrong even if the offer came from a potential enemy. The War Marshal decided that observing human medical technology might provide valuable intelligence about their biological capabilities, and she assigned her best security teams to monitor Tai Ho during his visits to the medical bays. What she did not expect was how efficiently the human commander worked, or how his casual conversations with injured Krex soldiers would plant seeds of doubt that would grow into something much more dangerous. Tai Ho moved through the medical facilities with practiced ease, examining wounds and offering treatment suggestions that showed impressive knowledge of Krex anatomy, despite his species having no previous contact with her people, the injured. Warriors responded well to his calm bedside manner, and many of them began talking about their experiences in the recent battles, while Tai Ho listened with apparent sympathy and asked thoughtful questions about tactical situations. During these Conversations. The human commander made observations about Vorth battle tactics that seemed designed to help Krek's soldiers understand their enemies better, but contained subtle distortions that painted the insect warriors as more cunning and dangerous than they actually were. Heiho mentioned noticing interesting Vorth flanking maneuvers during recent engagements, and he described attack patterns that the wounded Kreks remembered differently, but his confident delivery made them question their own recollections. The human explained that his elevated position during the battle had given him a better view of the overall tactical situation, and he pointed out details that individual soldiers would have missed while focused on their immediate survival. These details included references to Vorth stealth units that had allegedly penetrated Krek's defensive lines and coordinated attacks that suggested much more sophisticated planning than anyone had previously suspected. Young Captain Young Ho listened to these conversations from his hospital bed, where he was recovering from plasma burns, and he began to wonder how much the Krek's command staff really understood about their enemies. The captain had been fighting the Vorth for months, and he thought he knew their capabilities, but Heiho's observations suggested that the insect warriors had been holding back significant portions of their strength for reasons that remained unclear. When Young Ho asked why the Vorth would conceal their true abilities, Heiho suggested that they might be preparing for a final overwhelming assault that would catch the Krek's fleet completely unprepared. The human commander spoke about military deception with the expertise of someone who had studied many different species, and he explained how advanced civilizations often used misdirection to lull their enemies into false confidence. Meanwhile, Heiho was conducting similar conversations aboard Vorth medical facilities, where his analysis of Krek's tactics painted them as possessing secret weapons and advanced technologies that could turn the tide of battle at any moment. Prime Mind Jamin had reluctantly agreed to allow the human access to injured Vorth warriors, partly because the collective was curious about human biological knowledge, and partly because refusing humanitarian aid seemed unnecessarily hostile. The Vorth medical facilities were very different from their Krek's equivalents, with organic healing chambers that resembled giant insect cocoons and treatment protocols that involved direct neural interface between patients and medical technicians. Heiho adapted to these differences with impressive flexibility, and he demonstrated medical techniques that accelerated healing processes in ways that surprised even Vorth bioengineers who had spent centuries perfecting their methods. During his work, the human commander engaged wounded Vorth in discussions about recent battles, and he mentioned observing Krek's stealth, technologies that had allowed individual warriors to infiltrate Vorth formations undetected. Secondary Mind Na Iyun was responsible for coordinating medical operations, and she found herself disturbed by Heiho's casual references to Krek's capabilities that did not match intelligence reports from the front lines. The human described seeing Krek's soldiers using personal cloaking devices and advanced armor systems that could deflect energy weapons while maintaining full mobility and combat effectiveness. When Nayun pointed out that Vorth sensors had never detected such technologies, Heiho suggested that the devices might operate on principles that Vorth equipment was not designed to recognize. The human explained that different species often developed technologies along completely different paths, and what seemed impossible to one civilization might be routine for another with different scientific foundations. Nayun began to worry that the collective's intelligence gathering had missed crucial developments in Krek's military technology, and she started reviewing battle recordings looking for evidence of the capabilities Heiho had described. Back aboard his survey ship, Heiho maintained regular contact with his AI companion Bo Ram, who appeared as a holographic projection that demonstrated human-computer technology far beyond what either alien fleet possessed. Bo Ram processed tactical data in real time and provided analysis that revealed the true positions and capabilities of both fleets, with accuracy that would have been impossible using conventional sensors. The AI reported that both alien forces were responding exactly as predicted to the misinformation campaign, and paranoia levels were rising steadily as commanders began questioning their previous assumptions about enemy capabilities. Heiho reviewed psychological profiles that his team had compiled on key alien personnel, and he noted with satisfaction that War Marshal Subin and Prime Mind Jamin were both showing signs of increased stress and strategic uncertainty. The human commander understood that warfare between advanced species was as much about psychology as firepower, and he had been systematically undermining the confidence that both sides had built up over months of successful operations. Subin found herself studying intelligence reports with new suspicion as she tried to identify the Vorth capabilities that Tae-ho had described, and her growing paranoia infected her command staff, who began seeing threats in routine enemy movements. The War Marshal ordered increased defensive preparations and deeper scans of surrounding space because she could not shake the feeling that the Vorth were planning something catastrophic that would catch her fleet unprepared. Her tactical officers began reporting sensor contacts that might have been stealth units and communication intercepts that suggested coordinated enemy operations, even when analysis showed nothing more than routine patrol activities. Krek's fleet started repositioning into more defensive formations that sacrificed offensive capability for protection against attacks that existed only in their increasingly paranoid imagination. Jaemin experienced similar effects as the hive mind. Collective began processing reports about advanced Krek's technologies, and the psychological impact spread through the network like a virus that infected every connected consciousness. Vorth tactical planning shifted toward countering threats that intelligence could not confirm, and fleet movements became more cautious as commanders tried to prepare for enemies that might not exist. The collective began developing countermeasures against Krek's stealth technology and advanced armor systems, while diverting resources from offensive operations to defensive preparations. Both fleets were now fighting phantom enemies that Tae-ho had created through careful manipulation of their perceptions, and the psychological warfare was more effective than any physical weapon could have been. Captain Young-ho started questioning orders that seemed based on intelligence he could not verify, and he noticed that other officers were expressing similar doubts about their commander's grasp of the tactical situation. Secondary mind Ne Yun found herself arguing with other Vorth tactical coordinators about threat assessments that seemed increasingly disconnected from observable reality. The human commander monitored these developments with professional satisfaction, while maintaining his cover as a neutral observer who was simply trying to help both sides understand their situation better. Tae-ho knew that paranoid enemies would eventually turn their suspicions toward each other, and his job was to accelerate that process until both fleets became too focused on imaginary threats to notice real ones approaching from human space. Intelligence Officer Mi Young had been suspicious of the human from the moment he arrived because her training taught her to question everything and everyone, especially when they appeared too helpful or too knowledgeable about things they should not understand. The young Krek's officer spent her duty shifts analyzing the data streams from Commander Tae-ho's survey ship, and what she found made her scales crawl with fear because the vessel was not behaving like a damaged craft, drifting helplessly. Through space, Mi Young discovered that the human ship had been conducting systematic scans of both fleets, using sensor techniques that were far more sophisticated than anything in Krek's databases, and the scanning patterns showed clear military intelligence gathering rather than scientific survey work. The ship's energy emissions were all wrong for a disabled vessel because damaged systems did not maintain such precise power distribution or execute such coordinated sensor sweeps across multiple electromagnetic spectra. When Mi Young brought her concerns to War Marshal Subin, the commander initially dismissed them as paranoid speculation, but the intelligence officer had prepared detailed evidence that was impossible to ignore. The EI scanning data showed that Tae-ho's ship had mapped every Krek's vessel down to individual weapon placements, crew quarters, and structural weak points with accuracy that suggested prolonged observation and advanced analysis capabilities. Even more disturbing was evidence that the human vessel had been conducting similar scans of the Vorth fleet, which meant that whatever Tae-ho was really doing had nothing to do with requesting safe passage or offering humanitarian aid. Subin realized that she had been played by a master intelligence operative who had used her own protective instincts and military honor against her while gathering enough information to plan the destruction of her entire fleet. Meanwhile, in the depths of space beyond, the range of conventional sensors, Vorth, Scout Mind, Dongmin, was detecting gravitational anomalies that should not exist in an area that both fleets had surveyed extensively before beginning their battle. The Vorth had evolved enhanced spatial awareness that allowed them to sense large masses moving through hyperspace, and what Dongmin was feeling made his chitin plates rattle with instinctive fear. Something massive was approaching the Valdris system, and the gravitational signatures suggested. Not one large object, but many smaller ones moving in perfect formation with coordination that implied advanced fleet operations. Dongmin tried to focus his senses through the collective consciousness, but the distances involved made precise identification impossible until the approaching objects began to emerge from hyperspace at the edge of the system. The first ships to appear were reconnaissance vessels that immediately began broadcasting identification codes in the same format that Commander Taeho had been using, which meant that the human had not been alone after all. Prime mind. Jaemin felt shock ripple through the hive mind as more ships continued to emerge from hyperspace in a display of coordinated fleet movement that demonstrated tactical precision beyond anything the Vorth had ever achieved. The human vessels appeared one after another in perfect formation, with timing so exact that it seemed like watching a mechanical process rather than organic decision-making, and the technological implications were terrifying. Admiral Hyunwoo commanded the lead ship, and his first transmission to both alien fleets carried the calm authority of someone who held overwhelming military superiority and knew exactly how to use it. Admiral's message was brief and direct, stating that this sector was now under human protection and that the conflict between the Krex Empire and Vorth Collective would end immediately. Subin watched her tactical displays with growing horror as human ships continued to arrive until her screens showed 12 massive dreadnoughts, 40 heavy cruisers, and over 100 support vessels arranged in battle formation. The human fleet moved with mechanical precision that made even Vorth coordination look clumsy, and their weapon systems powered up with energy signatures that indicated firepower levels far beyond anything either alien species possessed. War Marshal Subin had commanded fleets in battles across the galaxy, but she had never seen anything like the display of technological superiority that the humans were demonstrating with casual ease. Each human ship was larger and more heavily armed than the finest vessels in the Krex fleet, and their defensive systems showed energy patterns that suggested armor and shielding technologies that neither the Krex nor Vorth had developed. The formation itself was a work of art that maximized overlapping fields of fire while maintaining perfect defensive coverage, and the positioning demonstrated tactical thinking that was several generations ahead of conventional military doctrine. Prime mind Jaemin tried to analyze the human fleet through the collective consciousness, but the Vorth sensor networks could not penetrate the alien ships' defensive screens or identify specific weapon systems. What was clear was that the humans had been planning this intervention for a long time, and their arrival was not a response to recent events, but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated operation. Commander Taeho finally revealed his true purpose during a joint communication session with both fleet commanders, and his explanation shattered every assumption they had made about human intentions. The survey mission had been a cover for the most comprehensive military intelligence operation in galactic history, and both the Krex Empire and Vorth Collective had been under human observation for months. Taeho explained that humanity had been evaluating potential threats to their expansion plans, and the war between the two alien powers had provided a perfect opportunity to assess their military capabilities, tactical thinking, and psychological profiles. Every battle, every strategic decision, and every tactical innovation had been recorded and analyzed by human intelligence services, who now possessed complete understanding of both species' strengths and weaknesses. The human commander spoke about the conflict as if it had been a laboratory experiment designed to test theories about alien military behavior, and his casual tone made it clear that human strategic planning operated on scales that neither enemy had imagined. Admiral Hyunwoo's fleet had been positioned just outside sensor range for weeks, waiting for the intelligence gathering phase to conclude, and the timing of their arrival demonstrated coordination that required planning. Far in advance, Subin realized that while her forces had been fighting desperately for survival, the humans had been watching from the shadows and taking notes, like scientists observing laboratory specimens. The War Marshal felt her warrior pride crumble as she understood that everything she had accomplished in months of brutal warfare had been meaningless because the real decision-makers had been evaluating her performance from the beginning. Jaemin experienced similar devastation as the hive mind processed the implications of being studied and categorized by a species that treated their most important military operation as a training exercise. The collective had always believed that their unity gave them advantages over individual thinkers, but human intelligence had penetrated their collective consciousness and mapped their decision-making processes with scientific precision. Both alien commanders found themselves facing a strategic situation that their military training had never prepared them for, because they were not just outgunned but completely outclassed by enemies who understood them better than they understood themselves. Captain Young-ho listened to the human revelations from his medical bay and realized that every doubt he had expressed about enemy capabilities had been based on information that Tae-ho had deliberately planted. The human psychological warfare campaign had been designed to create exactly the kind of paranoia and strategic confusion that would make both fleets easier to defeat if military action became necessary. Secondary Mind Na-yun felt the same sick realization, as she understood that her concerns about Krek's stealth technology had been manufactured by human intelligence operatives who knew exactly which fears would be most effective. The medical visits that had seemed like humanitarian gestures had actually been psychological warfare missions designed to undermine military morale and create strategic uncertainty. Both fleets now faced the choice between withdrawing with their remaining forces intact or challenging an enemy that had already demonstrated complete mastery of the tactical situation. Admiral Hyun-woo waited patiently for their response while his fleet maintained perfect formation and his weapons remained powered but not yet targeted because the humans wanted to give both sides the opportunity to make the intelligent choice. The silence stretched across space as two proud military forces tried to process the reality that their invincible armies had been reduced to irrelevance by the arrival of enemies they had never seen coming. The human dreadnought Indomitable emerged from hyperspace like a metal mountain given the power of movement, and Captain Ginny watched from the bridge as both alien fleets reacted to the sight of human military technology in its full glory. Massive vessels stretched over 2 kilometers from bow to stern with armor plating that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and weapon systems that hummed with barely contained energy that could sterilize entire continents. Admiral Hyun-woo stood at the center of the bridge, surrounded by holographic displays that showed every ship in both alien fleets, along with complete tactical analysis that his staff had been refining for weeks. The Admiral was a veteran of human expansion operations, who had overseen first contact with 17 different species, and he understood the psychology of military surrender better than any officer in the Terran fleet. Tactical officer So Young reported that both alien fleets were powering down their weapon systems as their commanders realized the futility of resistance against technology that was generations ahead of their own capabilities. The Kreks and Vorth had spent months destroying each other with plasma cannons and bioweapons, while human ships carried armaments that operated on principles neither species had discovered. Admiral Hyun-woo opened communication channels to both fleets simultaneously, and his message carried the quiet authority of someone who held absolute power over the tactical situation. The Admiral's voice remained calm and professional as he explained that human forces had been monitoring the conflict and had determined that continued warfare served no useful purpose for any of the species involved. He offered both sides the opportunity to withdraw their remaining forces with honor intact, but made it clear that further hostilities in this sector would not be tolerated by human authority. War Marshal Subin listened to the ultimatum with growing despair as she realized that her proud Krek's fleet had been reduced to irrelevance by enemies who could have ended the battle at any time they chose. The War Marshal had dedicated her life to expanding Krek's territory and establishing her people as a dominant force in galactic politics. But now she faced the reality that humanity had already claimed that position. Zubin looked at her tactical displays and saw that human ships were positioned with mathematical precision that maximized their firepower while minimizing the possibility of effective retaliation. The Krek's fleet had lost nearly half its strength during months of warfare, but even at full power they would have been helpless against the technological superiority that humanity was demonstrating. Prime Mind Jae-min felt the collective consciousness struggling to process defeat on a scale that challenged every assumption the Vorth had made about their place in the galaxy. The hive mind had always believed that unity gave them advantages over individual thinkers, but human coordination was perfect without requiring any shared consciousness at all. Jaemin watched human ships move through complex maneuvers with timing so precise that it suggested either artificial intelligence beyond Vorth comprehension or training standards that produced superhuman performance. The collective had conquered 12 star systems through superior coordination and overwhelming numbers, but humanity had achieved the same results. With smaller forces and better technology, Admiral Hyun-woo waited exactly 60 seconds for responses from both fleet commanders before transmitting detailed withdrawal routes that would allow both sides to leave the system without crossing each other's paths. The routes were planned with the same precision that characterized everything else about human military operations, and they demonstrated complete understanding of alien ship capabilities and navigational limitations. Captain Jin A monitored communications between alien vessels as both fleets struggled to accept the new reality, and she noted the psychological profiles that human intelligence had developed were proving accurate in every detail. The Kreks were having difficulty accepting orders to retreat because their warrior culture equated withdrawal with dishonor. But their practical nature eventually overcame pride when faced with impossible odds. The Vorth were experiencing collective confusion as individual minds. Within the hive mind network began questioning decisions that had seemed logical before human intervention changed all the parameters. Commander Tae-ho received extraction orders and prepared to transfer to the flagship, while his survey vessel's AI companion Bo-Ram compiled final intelligence reports on both alien species. The holographic AI had been recording every interaction and analyzing behavioral patterns that would help human strategic planners predict future actions. By both the Krex Empire and Vorth Collective. Bo-Ram's analysis confirmed that both species would require significant time to recover from their losses, and that neither posed an immediate threat to human expansion plans in this region. Tae-ho gathered his personal equipment and prepared to leave the survey ship that had served as his base of operations during one of the most successful intelligence missions in human history. The commander felt professional satisfaction as he reviewed the psychological warfare campaign that had turned two enemy fleets against each other without firing a single shot. Young Captain Young-ho watched from his medical bay as Krek's ships began forming up for withdrawal, and he realized that everything he had believed about galactic military balance had been wrong. The captain had thought the war between his people and the Vorth represented the peak of military technology, but human capabilities made both sides look like primitives fighting with crude weapons. Secondary mind. Na-eon coordinated Vorth withdrawal procedures while trying to understand how her people could have missed the emergence of such a dominant military power. The collective prided itself on comprehensive intelligence gathering, but humanity had been expanding through space for decades without triggering any of the warning systems that should have detected their activities. Intelligence Officer Mi-young filed reports that would reach Krek's high command within days and spark major changes in military doctrine as her people tried to adapt to a galaxy where they were no longer among the strongest powers. Mi-young understood that her career would be defined by her failure to detect human operations until it was too late to matter, and she wondered how many other species had made the same mistake. Admiral Hyun-woo watched both alien fleets begin their withdrawal with professional satisfaction, because achieving strategic objectives without unnecessary bloodshed was always preferable to victory through destruction. The Admiral understood that defeated enemies who were allowed to retreat with dignity were more likely to accept human authority in future encounters than enemies who were humiliated or destroyed. Human strategic doctrine emphasized demonstrating overwhelming superiority rather than using it, because psychological victory was more permanent than military conquest. Captain Jin I prepared departure orders for the human fleet because their mission was complete, and other sectors required attention from forces that could project power across interstellar distances. The captain had participated in similar operations throughout human space, and she knew that this intervention would be remembered as the moment when galactic politics shifted permanently. Tactical Officer So Young transmitted final sensor readings to fleet intelligence as both alien forces jumped to hyperspace carrying news that would spread throughout their respective territories. The data showed that human technology was advancing faster than either enemy had imagined, and that military parity between species was becoming impossible to maintain. Commander Tae-ho arrived aboard the Indomitable and reported to Admiral Hyun-woo with intelligence estimates that confirmed human assumptions about alien military capabilities. The survey mission had gathered enough information to plan counter-strategies for both species and identify the technological developments that would maintain human military superiority. Admiral Hyun-woo reviewed Taeho's reports while his fleet prepared to jump to their next assignment, and he noted with satisfaction that psychological warfare remained humanity's most effective weapon. The Admiral understood. That fear of human military power would spread faster than actual human ships, and that reputation was often more valuable than physical presence. Both the Krex Empire and Vorth Collective would return to their home territories carrying stories of human technological superiority that would influence strategic planning for generations. The invincible armies that had terrorized entire sectors fell silent before a single human observer, and the warship that came to collect him and the galaxy would never be the same.